and I will have a look and see how we're generally doing, but we know it's roughly 20 seconds. Okay, pretty sure we're live. So on that note, I will start, and if we're not, then what can I say? Nobody's perfect. Okay, so hello and welcome everyone to this live recording of the Braincare podcast by Heights. Now, if you've not had a chance yet to check it out, every episode is just 15 minutes long and designed to help you take care of the brain that takes care of you. And we feature world-leading experts on an array of topics, from better-known people like Stephen Fry and Jay Shetty to leading experts like the head of neuroscience at UCL or the head of neurosurgery at Stanford University and nutritional experts like Rhiannon Lambert and more. We exist to help you feed your brain with simple ideas and tips so you can take care of your brain and help you reach your heights. Now, as you know, today's topic is sleep. For those that don't know, my journey to starting Heights actually started with insomnia and ended up at a dietitian who prescribed me supplements. And having tried and failed to solve my problem before, I'd been to the doctor, he'd just given me sleeping pills. I wasn't keen to take them. I'd been to sleep therapy and I tried everything else I could find to cure my issue on a psychological level. But the dietitian pointed out my issue was more biological, which is why nutrition worked for me. Now, of course, there are multiple reasons why people struggle with sleep. This was just my personal stance and journey, but we're here to unpack all of it in more detail, psychological and biological. So this conversation is ultimately from a former insomniac and a sleep nerd learning with you from a bona fide expert. Now, as we're going to be recording live for a podcast, you're going to hear the intro twice, so just forgive that. But hopefully you'll learn plenty too, and we've got a bunch of questions submitted by our community for Q&A as well to delve into that. So, Sophie, if you're ready, can you hit record on your local audio?
I have done that, yes.
Excellent, me too. Absolutely professional. Let's get into it. Dr. Sophie Bostock is a sleep expert, and I say that as a former insomnia sufferer, so I've seen my fair share. Now, sharing the science of sleep and performance in actionable ways through keynote talks, one-to-one coaching, corporate workshops, and just constant brilliant content I love following, I'm lucky to call her both an expert that I learned from and a friend. So, hello, Sophie, and welcome to the Braincare podcast.
Hi, Dan. Thanks very much for having me.
In your own words, before we get going, what drew you to the world of sleep as your particular area of expertise, just to set the scene for our audience so they know?
Oh, it was an accident. I was hunting for happiness. I was actually studying a PhD in a field called psychobiology, which is all about that mind-body connection. And this was 10 years ago. I was at UCL as a student, and I wanted to design a trial where I could investigate whether making people happy through more positive emotions would reduce their stress. And to do that, I decided to use mindfulness meditation. So I tracked down this company that were 5 minutes away that had a meditation app called Headspace. And I used this app in a trial, and 8 weeks later, a lot of people kind of came back having used the app, and they said, well, I don't know if I've learned to meditate, but I'm definitely sleeping better. And so when I looked at the data, I realized that actually the better sleepers were the ones who were happier, who were less stressed. And this was really opening the door to me to show that better sleep and better mental health are absolutely intertwined, and one affects the other. And so at that point, I became hooked, and I went to go and work with a team at Sleepio, who have an online digital sleep improvement program. And now I work kind of independently, doing some quite interesting projects with lots of clients from different fields like the military, the police, and sports. And it never ceases to fascinate me.
And it also seems like you caught the right zeitgeist at the right time as well.
Yes, you will have noticed that Headspace has grown since its days on Tottenham Court Road.
So the topic we want to focus on in this episode specifically is sleeping in an uncertain world with stress. So just tell me, from what you've seen, are more people sleeping badly currently than in the pre-pandemic world?
Well, it's not just me, but lots of researchers around the world have found quite consistent findings, actually, which is that we've seen changes globally to the amount of time people sleep, the quality of their sleep, and actually the time of night when they're sleeping. So just as one example, a study from King's College London, they published a survey in June. So this was towards the start of lockdown last year, suggesting that 1 in 2 adults were reporting worse sleep in response to the pandemic. But that increased to 2/3 for those who acknowledged that they were finding coronavirus stressful. But at the same time, probably 1 in 4 people actually said they were waking up feeling more rested. So it didn't affect everybody in the same way. But in terms of the time that people were sleeping, we've tended to see bedtime shift back and wake times also shift back, which makes sense if you don't have to get up to catch a 6 o'clock train. But I think probably the most common issue, which I've seen working with companies, and also interestingly, when Heights members sent their questions in, loads of people saying, I'm waking up in the middle of the night and I can't get back to sleep. What can I do?
So what kind of things do you think are actually causing us to struggle more with our sleep now than before?
Oh, it's a whole different kind of mixed picture, but there's 3 kind of main systems which control when we sleep. And you can kind of think of coronavirus hitting all 3 like a triple whammy. So on the one hand, we've got our circadian rhythms, our internal body clock, and that's our kind of pre-programmed 24-hour cycle that we've been designed to be more active during daylight hours and to rest at night. And we rely on these signals like our wake-up time, like light and movement, and also food to tell us that it's daytime. And the absence of those things helps to cue up that we should be ready for sleep. So, of course, as soon as your routines start to get a bit more haphazard, you no longer have to do the same things at the same time every day, your body clocks get quite confused. And the more time you spend indoors under artificial light and the less exposure you have to the much more intense natural daylight, the more your internal sort of master clock is uncertain what's day, what's night. So we've had sleepiness kind of intruding on the day, but also that increased alertness increasing in the nighttime. So that's your body clocks. And then the second system is something called sleep pressure, which is a bit more straightforward. And really, this just is something which accumulates a drowsy inducing chemical called adenosine. And the longer you have been awake, the more of this adenosine you build up, like a sleepy pressure. And so if you've had a little bit less pressure on during the day and you've had a long nap perhaps, or you've decided to have a bit of a lie-in, then when it comes to bedtime, you're not going to have as much sleep pressure. So it's going to be harder to get to sleep. But then finally, I think probably the most important system which has been disrupted is that balance of stress or relaxation. So on the one hand, these 2 branches of our autonomic nervous system, which look after all of those processes that we don't usually think about, like breathing and heart rate and temperature. On the one hand, we've got the sympathetic branch, which is our fight or flight stress response, which is designed to enhance survival. So if we're in danger, then we release this cascade of stress hormones. But on the other hand, we've got our rest or digest system, and that's what we want really for a restful night's sleep. But it kind of makes sense that if you are in danger, if you're surrounded by a pack of saber-toothed tigers, you don't want to be able to get into a nice deep sleep. So over generations, we've evolved so that if we feel under threat, our sleep becomes lighter. So cortisol, that nasty kind of stress hormone that hangs around when things get a bit much, that banishes melatonin. And so we're less ready for bed. We tend to have lighter sleep and we're more likely to wake up during the night. And I think a lot of people wouldn't necessarily recognize that they've been stressed. Maybe their job's been okay. But what research has found is that the things which spike that cortisol response are situations which are uncontrollable, unpredictable, new, or threaten our status in some way. And that might be, if you're an athlete and you can no longer go and train, that's still a threat to your status, your identity. So it might not feel stressful to you, but it's kind of annoying and it interferes with your normal social life. Also, loneliness is another stressor which can increase cortisol and increase the rates of insomnia. So it's a triple whammy, Dan.
And like the idea that I guess that we're locked indoors, like it's Groundhog Day as well, right? Does that, is a sort of lack of novelty a thing as well?
Well, I think there's a lack of stimulation, which can kind of cause frustration and negative emotions because you're not able to do those things, which usually would put you in a positive state. We know that in order to be able to sleep well, the ideal things that you feel safe and positive, secure and relaxed. And in the context of this global uncertainty, even if your direct environment feels very familiar, you've got a lot of worry in the background that's totally out of your control.
Okay, and then I guess, specifically for managing our sleep in times like this, what are your top tips or pieces of advice or opportunities to improve it that we might have for certainly the people that you've been working with, right? So I'm sure you've been giving out lots of advice and hopefully getting some results back from people on whether it's working or not. So what is and isn't working?
I think one of the most useful things is just reassurance that poor sleep and anxiety are bidirectionally connected. So even if you wouldn't normally think about yourself as an anxious person, one night of poor sleep can kind of increase the sensitivity of the part of our brain that switches on your stress response. So the amygdala, it's like the gatekeeper. And we know that it becomes more sensitive when you haven't had a good night's sleep. So what you can find, particularly in the middle of the night, is that you react to situations in this very inflated way that, after a good night's sleep, you would never react like this. And you can get stuck in a cycle of worry, which is not logical. It's not like you. And you know that when you wake up in the morning, you're going to feel totally differently. So in that moment, in the middle of the night, you've got to slow your amygdala down. You can't get caught in these trains of negative thought. And one of the great hacks to sort of stop the amygdala in its tracks is just simply to breathe, and to breathe slowly. And this sends a direct signal into the brain through the vagus nerve that you are not in danger. Because if you are in danger and the saber-toothed tigers are waking up, you're going to be gasping or you're going to be running and you're going to be panting. So just simply breathing all the way out and all the way in. And I actually happened to watch Karate Kid 2 last night. And the advice that Mr. Miyagi gave to Daniel-san as he was trying to calm him down was simply breathe. And he put his hands together and he breathed all the way out and all the way in. And if you just do this, take control of your breath for a few times, it gives that the prefrontal cortex, the logical, rational part of your brain, time to come back online. And sometimes that's all you need to just banish some of these negative thoughts. So that's the first thing.
Yeah.
Secondly, I would say is a sleep diary. This is incredibly old school, actually a pen and paper sleep diary when you track the time that you went to sleep, the time that you woke up, and how long you slept. How long you were awake for if you woke up during the night. And the reason that I recommend a pen and paper diary is because that conscious action of writing these things down and looking at patterns, and you can absolutely draw from a tracker if you use one, but actually that deliberate act of seeing what it looks like over the course of the week can be very powerful. Sometimes it tells you that your sleep is not as bad as you thought. And other times you actually spot patterns, or you're like, oh yeah, Tuesday night, that was when I opened that last bottle of wine. And you start to realize that there are things that you can do. And the more you can see progress and feel less worried about sleep, the better your sleep is going to get. And then probably the last simple thing is, if the world feels uncertain and we're all living in this context where there's lots of things out of our control, take control of what you can. Plan your wind down routine. Plan the time that you are going to spend an hour before bed. What are you going to do that's going to make you feel good before sleep? And if you just leave it to chance, I guarantee you're not going to end up with a delightful hour that's suddenly free. So you've got to protect that time. And we all know that, when the pandemic hit, we were all thirsty for information. And lots of people got into the habit of searching the news, searching social media. And it's not your fault. There's part of your brain which is craving reassurance. But we're in a global pandemic. There's no brilliant news that's going to reassure you at that time. Actually, the more news you get, the more worried you get. And plus, you've got the kind of negative blue light as well, which is activating and banishing melatonin. So that last hour of the day is precious. So put an alarm in your phone for the final hour of the day, and that's your cue to switch off and plan in something nice. Listen to a podcast, have a lovely warm hot bath, read a book, just chat to your partner. Quality time that doesn't involve sort of dependence on technology. It's so simple, but most of us forget to do it. So plan it in.
And before we close this out, a question that I'm sure other people want to know: what time do you go to bed?
Oh, usually I'm sort of switching off by 10, but I'll read. I'll read in bed for about half an hour before I switch the light out.
I'm super glad you said that, because I genuinely thought you were about to say 8 p.m. or something.
Oh
You know,
gosh.
you do have these health experts that you talk to, and then they give you all this advice that you really buy into, and then you ask them what they do, and you're like, oh, okay. I mean, I'm
No,
not going
and
to go to bed
I would
at,
also say
whenever I sleep.
I'll
That's
cut
fine.
myself some slack. You know, one of the wonderful things about knowing about sleep and having confidence about sleep is that you can shift things around a little bit. You shouldn't feel anxious if the routine doesn't pan out exactly the way that you plan, but it's much more likely to if you do actually have that plan in place and that routine. And familiarity here is absolutely key. You know, I'll speak to people and I say, well, I tried a hot bath and it didn't work, so I'm not going to do that again. But if you do it once, then it's new and you've got expectations that it's suddenly going to make a difference. But actually, if you repeat something a few times, 5, 6 times, the brain learns that that's what you do before bed. This is exactly what parents do as they help their kids wind down for bed. And they know that actually, if they do the same things in the same order, then there's a greater readiness for sleep. So it might take a little bit of time, but more times you repeat it, the more kind of consistent an effect that will have on your sleep.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Sophie. And look forward to having you on the next episode.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much to listeners in the live audience. We're going to get straight into the second episode, and then we're going to come up for air and do Q&A. So don't worry, everyone will have their opportunity. Just want to make it easier for our editors that we just go straight through for now. Welcome back to the Braincare podcast sleep special with the sleep scientist, Dr. Sophie Bostock. Now, in the last episode, we touched on why people will be struggling to sleep in times of uncertainty and how to alleviate that. In this episode, we're going to focus more on some of the practical tips, habits, and indeed nutrients that can help you with your sleep. So, welcome back, Sophie.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here.
As you know, my particular flavor of insomnia was due to a biological rather than psychological issue when it came to sleep. So I just simply wasn't feeding my brain what it needed to thrive. And as a result, I was struggling. Now, let's start at the nutritional level. What nutrients do we need for an improved night's sleep that we should be getting in our regular diets from what you've seen?
I promise to answer that question, but first I have to do a minor caveat because there's going to be lots of people that hear that and they say, oh, how do I know if I've got a nutritional or a biological, psychological problem? And so I always say it's very difficult to tease the two out. So even when, you know, all your brilliant specialists did perhaps was give you a supplement, what they also gave you was reassurance. And because we know that anxiety about sleep is one of the things that really interferes with sleep, and perhaps she said, you know, take it at the same time every day, and people will start to perhaps change their routine as well as taking the supplement. There's kind of lots of pluses sometimes. So we may not be able to separate them. And so even giving somebody a placebo and telling them something is going to be good for their sleep, on average, helps them fall asleep 20% faster. So all this means is that when we look at the nutrition research, we have to be really careful before we put all of our confidence behind something which looks good, because it's got to be better than placebo. And those studies are starting to be done, but I think it's still very early stages.
Yeah, I think you mentioned something to me earlier about, you know, the Mediterranean diet that was particularly fascinating for you.
Yeah, so this is all relatively new. The last couple of years, it's been shown that the Mediterranean style diet, which is very rich in fruit and vegetables and fiber, olive oil, fatty fish, nuts and seeds, we've seen that people who have a greater proportion of their diet made up of kind of that Mediterranean style content tends to have better sleep. Whereas we know that people who tend to consume more processed foods, higher saturated fat, higher sugars, tend to have poorer sleep. So there's a number of reasons for this. We know that the Mediterranean diet is more of an anti-inflammatory diet, and that might help to reduce pain, which is one of the things that interferes with sleep. Sleep and the immune system are very tightly linked. But we also know that the Mediterranean diet feeds the microbiome, which helps to create hormones like dopamine, serotonin, and GABA, which are all associated with the sleep process. And it might actually be that improvements in mood and reductions in anxiety could be some of the things that are helping to improve sleep. But it could also be down to the micronutrients. And this is where there's a little bit less research. From big observational studies, we know that poorer sleepers tend to be more likely to be deficient in things like vitamin D, magnesium, vitamins E and C, which are antioxidants, some of the B vitamins. There's a whole mixed picture. But in order to be more confident that using these nutrients is going to improve our sleep, we need more intervention studies. And this is where the science is a little bit thin on the ground, I suppose. We do know from Cornell University that in one study where they fed people controlled amounts of fats, carbs, sugars, fibers over 5 days, they were able to show that the meals which had a higher fiber and protein content tended to be followed by deeper sleep than those that had a higher content of saturated fat and sugar. So again, that lab study backing up what we saw from the big observational studies. But when we look at supplements, we really need much better research. I think, even for the most established ingredients like tart cherry juice, which lots of people, nutritionists, will recommend. We've got research probably in total on 50 people, whereas actually some of the more established psychological interventions have got studies in thousands of people from hundreds of studies. So it doesn't mean that nutrition isn't important, but it does mean that the precise mechanics of who needs what and when are still things which are a little bit subject to trial and error, I think.
And obviously more so in America, but very common is melatonin, right? Which, sounds like it makes plenty of sense anyway to have that in supplement form, but certainly not over the counter available in Europe.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. So we know that melatonin, the hormone, helps to prepare the body for bed. It helps to regulate that body clock and stimulates the brain to know that it's nightfall. It's the hormone of darkness. But actually, in terms of sleep, it's quite a weak sedative effect. And so if you suffer from insomnia, melatonin is probably not going to be the solution. On average, I think one review found that it only helped people fall asleep 7 minutes faster. But if you've traveled across time zones, then melatonin is quite helpful to regulate the clock. And the older you get, the less melatonin you produce naturally. So potentially the more likely you are to need a supplement.
So one of the other common errors I think loads of people make is in hydration, right? So one of the common things we get, drinking too late in the day and then needing to go to the toilet, right? So that's a very classic one. Do you have any tips or insights or experience shares for people about keeping their bladders empty beyond the incredibly obvious go to the toilet earlier?
So I think one thing again is reassurance. It's perfectly normal to get up once to go to the toilet at night, and as you get older, that does tend to become more frequent. It's usually recommended to reduce your fluid intake perhaps 2 to 3 hours before bed. But again, this is a time when having a diary can be quite helpful, because if you start to reduce your fluid intake and you're not actually noticing any difference to that nighttime wakening, then that's something that you might want to discuss with your doctor. I think the other thing that's interesting about fluid intake at night is if you're finding that you've got to wake up to drink something because you've got a very dry mouth, that might be a sign that actually you've been breathing more through your mouth than your nose. And we know that nasal breathing is much better for your overall health. It seems to be associated with lower fatigue. We also think it's less likely to be associated with sleep apnea, which is a condition where people have breathing issues overnight. So if you do frequently have a dry mouth, then you might want to think about looking into that.
Interesting. Food for thought for me then. Although I have just got my Invisalign, so it might also have something to do with that as well. Okay, in your experience, what kind of daily habits can we try to integrate into our life that are going to improve our ability to sleep well?
I think it starts with mindset. It's the more that you see sleep as this kind of foundation that helps you build other habits. There's no doubt that better sleep helps you with self-control. So, if you're somebody who likes to plan your diet and you plan your exercise, then think about your week, looking ahead. Will you be able to get that 7 to 9 hour sleep window? Most adults are recommended to get between 7 and 9 hours sleep, but our sleep efficiency in terms of the amount of time in bed that we spend asleep is is, even for a great sleeper, only about 90%. So ideally, we want at least 8 hours actually in bed to give us a good shot of that sort of 7 hours plus of sleep. Second thing would be, we've talked about what you eat, but not when you eat. And in today's world, when we're all so massively busy, there's always a temptation to sort of save that lovely evening meal for a time when things are a bit calmer, perhaps after the kids have gone to bed. But actually eating late at night, we've said that it's one of those cues to your internal circadian rhythm that wakes you up. It actually also increases your body temperature, and that can interfere with falling asleep. So ideally, eat your evening meal at least 2 hours before you want to get into bed. And then I think I mentioned at the start of the first episode that a lot of people are in this state where they're kind of quite stressed. Sleep deprivation leads to increased stress, and that meditation can be very, very helpful. But I work with a lot of people who struggle to meditate. They're actually kind of quite wired. You get this tired but wired, where you're not sleeping well, so you've got increased adrenaline, increased cortisol, and the idea of sitting there and meditating for like half an hour, that's incredibly hard. So cut yourself some slack and just start with blocking out 15 minutes in your calendar during the day to do nothing. I'm not going to force you to meditate. I'm not going to force you to do anything at all, but just switch off from technology, switch off from work, and give yourself 15 minutes to just get used to slowing down. Because I think one of the problems is, if you only slow down after you've switched off the light at night, then your brain just doesn't know what to do with itself. You've still got all of this processing to do. So allow a little bit of time earlier in the day when you can just sort of catch up and get used to being a little bit more relaxed.
Great. Okay. And I mean, this is a question it's coming from a sort of place of selfishness, to be honest, but there's a lot written about sleep debt and the fact you don't really make it up. But at the same time, and I say this as an expecting father to a baby daughter in August, I remember having this conversation with you when we first started Heights and we were talking about all this. And I remember you pointing to that there isn't really any evidence to prove, for example, that parents die earlier than non-parents. So surely that's the greatest, larger study that's ever been done on sleep deprivation in different groups. So what's really going on here? What is the truth?
Well, firstly, congratulations. Very importantly, I'm super excited for you. And yes, you are absolutely right. We can give you and many other parents some reassurance. I think what's likely to be going on is that, we know over generations that small humans have always required a lot of work. So I don't think we need to panic. And in fact, if your sleep becomes disrupted for a number of weeks or even months, there's every chance that this is not going to have long-term impacts on your health. What it will do is cause acute issues like irritability, lack of memory, lack of concentration, and you won't be able to pay those back. That's still going to have disrupted the next day, but long term we don't think that those things always have an impact. I think as we get older, there is evidence that our circadian rhythms are a little bit less elastic. So for example, we struggle to cope more with shift work as we get older. So it might well be that prolonged exposure to sleep deprivation and prolonged circadian disruption, these things start to have a cumulative effect. So I think at whatever age you are, if you're struggling to cope with poor sleep, despite adequate opportunity to sleep, there are lots of effective treatments available, and probably cognitive behavioral therapy is probably the best place to start.
Great. Well, I mean, if that's the best place to start, what are the best places to avoid? And by that, I mean, what are your favorite sleep myths that you'd like to debunk here? So popular stories people hear or tell themselves that aren't necessarily true.
Again, a lot of it's down to reassurance that, just because you wake up during the night, that doesn't mean there's something horribly wrong with your sleep. That's perfectly normal. We all wake up for short periods of wakefulness. The other thing is that I think particularly at the moment, and I'm sitting here with a wrist tracker. I've also got an Aura ring. I was just so intrigued that I had to try it out.
I've got both.
And, in the couple of weeks that I've had it, I've noticed that there is relatively moderate correlation between these two trackers. So what you read about the accuracy of these things, it's probably pretty good for the overall amount of sleep, but any tracker is probably accurate in terms of the actual sleep stages about 50 to 60% of the time. Some of them might be slightly better, but because we don't yet have a recipe for the perfect night of sleep, we know that it changes. We know that it changes from night to night. If you've run a marathon, you're probably going to have more deep sleep, which is going to help you physically restore. So don't read too much into these trackers. And now having multiple ones of them, I can see that it leads to anxiety. I was like, yeah, I'll publish my sleep data. And the moment I thought that, my sleep started going out the window. So, if it is starting to worry you, take it off, put it in a drawer until you're a little bit more relaxed about it.
Very fair. Okay, as this is the Braincare podcast, the question we like to ask all our guests is, what does Braincare mean to you? And how does it manifest in your life?
I do love that term. I think to me, it means doing things which mean that you're living like the best version of yourself more of the time. And if there is a magic bullet for Braincare, it has to be sleep. After all, it is the process through which we take toxins from the brain, we consolidate memories, we enable ourselves to learn, we renew our self-control, we supercharge the immune system, and best of all, it's totally free. So it's my favorite.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sophie, for your time and brilliant insights.
Total pleasure.
Awesome. Thank you very much. So to everyone listening in the audience, that is basically how we record the podcast. You just happen to have the opportunity to watch us do it. So the reason that you would join in one of these conversations is obviously so you get to ask your questions. So our wonderful community manager, Emma, has provided me with a smorgasbord of conversational questions, both from the chat and then the ones that you submitted in advance. So we'll get straight into it. Lucy has asked, what are your thoughts about napping during the day?
Pros and cons. So napping can be brilliant, particularly if you're sleep deprived overnight. So Dan, I'm looking at you for when you're a new parent. If you've got very disrupted sleep overnight, you're struggling to keep your eyes open during the day, 15 to 20 minute nap, especially after lunch. We tend to have a little circadian lull where our circadian rhythm dips a little bit. Brilliant time to pep you up. The danger, of course, is if you have very disrupted sleep overnight. I mentioned sleep pressure earlier, and by having a long nap, especially late in the day. So I speak to parents sometimes who fall asleep when they're putting their kids to bed at like 6 or 7 o'clock. And then when it comes to going to bed themselves, they've used up that sleep pressure and they really struggle to sleep. So any disrupted sleep overnight, I'd say try and cut back on the naps.
Okay, thank you. Victoria has asked, can you overdose on sleep? I feel that days when I have a comfortable 9+ hours, I can actually feel more tired than when I'm rocking my day on 5 to 6 hours of snooze.
Right. So, okay, the rocking of the day on 5 to 6 hours of sleep. If you're sort of an average person, then actually that would be accumulating a sleep debt. And what happens to keep you awake is you are fueled by stress hormones, by adrenaline, by cortisol. You might also be consuming quite a lot of caffeine or sugar just to keep you awake. So during those days, you might actually feel like you are at a pretty high level of alertness, but you are accumulating this sleep debt. So when you finally go and try and catch up on that, you give yourself this gift of a 9-hour sleep. Just overnight, for one night, you cannot pay back several weeks or even a Monday to Friday's worth of sleep deprivation. So what's probably happening, a couple of things. It might well be that your payback of the sleep debt is incomplete. So you need a couple more nights of longer sleep to sort of pay that back. The other thing is that if your circadian rhythm is used to you getting up early in the morning and then you have a long lie-in, your body clock goes all over the place and it may not feel quite as sort of alert during the day the following day. So there's a kind of hangover effect of having a lie-in. So it's not always straightforward.
Yeah, double-edged sword really, isn't it? Okay, Iwona has asked, even though I sleep not less than 8 hours per night, I have a huge problem to wake up in the morning. Is there anything that causes that? What are the best ways to feel more rested in the morning?
Okay, really good question and not uncommon, particularly as we've seen through coronavirus. Lots of people waking up feeling a little bit more sort of unrefreshed. So several things could be going on here. It could be a seasonal problem. Lots of people struggle more to wake up in the winter because there's less natural daylight. So I did bring a couple of props. I have got here, this is my sad light, and this, if you turn it on, pumps out 10,000 lux, which is super intense bright light. So if you have issues with concentration and energy just in the winter months, then actually sitting in front of one of these for half an hour in the morning can really help to kind of kickstart the body clock. It banishes melatonin. If you are a teenager or a younger adult, if you are that lucky, then your body clock tends to be a bit shifted back. So more naturally, you're going to fall asleep probably after midnight, and your body clock doesn't really want to get out of bed until after 9 o'clock. So you're constantly fighting against this sort of want for sleep first thing in the morning. So if you want to shift your body clock forward, if you want to go from being a bit more of a night owl to being a bit more of a natural early bird, then you've got to use these Zeitgeber signals which help to regulate the clock. So that's light, plenty of bright light first thing in the morning, movement. So ideally, get up, get active, go for a walk, put your alarm clock on the other side of the room so that you have to move your body to go and switch it off so that you don't fall immediately back to sleep. And eating as well. So having breakfast within an hour of waking up can also sort of rev up the body clock, because the sooner you start the clock on the day, the more naturally sleepy you'll be at night. But conversely, it's really important, several hours before bed, you want to dial back on the food, don't exercise too late in the day, turn down the lights, and then hopefully you'll be ready for sleep earlier.
Great. Okay. Reassuring. This question is from Gaurav, and I'll be honest, it's a little bit random as far as I'm concerned. Maybe it does have some context to you. But hi, does turkey and milk combination work? And if it does, what's the plant-based version of this? Is there some myth of turkey and milk?
This is a myth. Actually, this is a great myth. We should have quashed this one earlier. So there is this theory that turkey is great for sleep, also similarly milk. And I think it is something to do with the tryptophan content. So tryptophan being one of the kind of building blocks of serotonin and melatonin. But the only problem is that both turkey and milk, they don't have particularly high concentration of tryptophan. Actually, there are other things that have a much higher concentration. And tryptophan doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier very easily. So simply consuming these things is probably not going to have a huge impact on your sleep. So it is a myth, officially a myth. We can quash that myth.
So you don't really want to give us a Linda McCartney and Oakley version of it?
I did once read that if in order to promote sleep, you would have to eat something like 60 turkeys. So,
right.
It could be a solution, but it's not a practical one for most of us.
No, indeed. Okay, so Liza says, how do the differences in female and male hormones affect how you sleep? Any tailored advice for each gender, please?
Ooh, great question. I think this has been studied more actually in the context of women, because women tend to have worse sleep. We are more likely to suffer from anxiety, from depression, and also insomnia. And some of this is down to certain times in our lives where we get fluctuations in hormones. So I'm not going to ask personal questions down, but in pregnancy, you may well find that your beloved has much worse sleep, particularly in the third trimester. So as the hormones, estrogen, progesterones kind of explode 60 times their normal amounts, it's massively disrupted to sleep. But then another time that we see very disrupted sleep is around menopause. And what's quite interesting is that it's not just the hormones. This is also at a time as we get older with natural aging that sleep becomes more disrupted. So things like cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, although they don't solve hormonal problems, they can help people to worry less about sleep, and therefore actually CBT for insomnia is the recommended solution even when you experience menopause. So yeah, I think women tend to get a kind of short end of the stick on that one.
I mean, I feel like that's the kind of expected answer that is sadly part of the perfectly and true. Yeah, I'm certainly learning that as my part in pregnancy is mostly just to ask, are you okay? So
very important function, Dan.
Very important question, sure. Question from Melody. How important is the time you sleep and wake up? If you're sleeping at 2 a.m. and still getting 8 hours of sleep, is that still unhealthy for your body?
It depends. So we know that natural night owls tend to have this tendency. So, lots of young adults will describe this pattern, and teenagers as well. The only problem is that society is not really, at least until the pandemic started, wasn't particularly set up for the life of a night owl. So what tends to happen is that you then still end up madly rushing in the morning to get to work. You get criticised because you're a bit late and you're not on the early morning calls. And actually, you probably don't do your best work until 7 or 8 o'clock at night, when you're not probably going to get the credit for it. So a lot of actually night owls tend to find that going through that process of trying to shift their body clock forward might actually be better in terms of fitting in with today's social context. There is a little bit of research as well that suggests that night owls might be more prone to depression, but whether or not that's because they're having to fit into doing things at time of day that their body isn't really ready for, we're not quite sure.
Great, awesome answer, thank you. Vanessa has asked, is there such a thing as catch up on your sleep? Do a few lie-ins, for example, balance out a few late nights?
If only. I mean, it's a really difficult one, because if you're compressing your sleep during the week, you massively want to catch up. But when you catch up at the weekend, you put your body clock through this increased pressure. So you have a lovely lie-in on a Saturday morning, maybe a Sunday morning. Then come Monday morning, it's like you've flown in from Tehran and you really struggle. And what we do know is there's this phenomenon called social jet lag, which is this idea of almost causing your body clock pressure by coming backwards and forwards every weekend. And one study found that for every hour of social jet lag, there was a 13% increased risk of heart disease in the long term. It also increased your risk of weight gain. So it's not ideal. It definitely puts more pressure on the body clock. And if you feel that you can't extend your weeknight sleep to 7 to 9 hours, just try an extra 15 minutes from what you're doing now, and hopefully reduce that sleep debt just by a little bit. Every little counts.
Got it. Okay. Question from Charlie. If you wake up in the middle of the night, is it best to do something like read a book or just try to get back to sleep?
I think it depends on how you feel. So if sometimes you wake up and you just know you're not going to be able to fall back to sleep, you feel very alert, I would always try a breathing technique. Give yourself a chance to fall back to sleep naturally. But if that's just not happening for you, it is certainly better, rather than wallowing there, getting super frustrated that you can't sleep, that creates negative associations in our brain between our bed and not sleeping. So he's absolutely right. If you're awake for more than, say, 15 or 20 minutes, and it's not a hard and fast rule, just, about that long, then do get up, get out of bed. I'd certainly switch a light on, read a book, just almost forget about going back to sleep. That doesn't mean playing super active video games or something. Do something calming. Listen to the Heights Braincare podcast, that sort of thing, until your eyelids start to feel heavy, and only at that point get back into bed, because you want to strengthen the connection between your bed and sleep. So that's where you want to be sleeping. Try not to get into the habit of just sleeping on the sofa or the spare room. Our brains learn through association.
Great. Okay, this one's a two-parter from Anthony Cat, and it will be our last two, but they are great. So I saved, well, not the best till last, but saved some good ones. The first is about nightmares. So when dealing with stress or anxiety in your day, that can sometimes affect your sleep by manifesting as powerful nightmares, which wake you up and often make it hard to get back to sleep. Do you have any recommendations on how to prepare better for bed to avoid a nightmare and or go back to sleep after a nightmare?
Actually, I do. I love this question. So I've been doing quite a lot of work with the police, and we know that in the police and the military, PTSD is very common, and it's often associated with nightmares. So I learned this technique from a guy called Dr. Justin Havens, and he's got a brilliant animation on YouTube called the dream completion technique. And what it involves, it's particularly good if you've got a repetitive nightmare, but it can work for anything. You don't have to relive the nightmare. But when you wake up and you've been woken up because of a horrible dream, just try and remember the thing that was happening at the point that you woke up, and then write that down. So what is it that ultimately happened just before you woke up? Write it down, and then get creative. This is where you come up with a much more compelling ending for that dream. Ideally, something which is vaguely entertaining, potentially erotic. It does not have to be ethical. It could be anything. If I'm talking to kids, I'll usually say, what's your favorite superpower? And imagine that you develop that superpower so you can turn them to stone or you can fly away. And so you then rehearse a better ending for that dream. You might want to write it down. And then before you fall asleep, run through that fun, better, arousing, who knows, exciting ending for that dream. And one of three things will happen. Firstly, you won't dream that dream at all, in which case that's a success. Secondly, you might have that dream and you might actually have this crazy kind of lucid awareness of that dream and be able to either change it or just wake up before it gets scary. And the third thing is that it might not work and you might still have a bad dream. But in that case, that's okay. Don't panic. You've just got to come up with something a little more creative, a little more compelling for your brain and try it again. So you might need to try a couple of times, but I've honestly worked with people for whom that has worked after just a couple of tries. So I really recommend that technique. I think it's good.
What about cheese, by the way? Is that a myth?
Myth.
Myth.
Really?
Really?
It has been tested by Surrey University, yes. They tested all
great.
kinds of different types of cheese. There's no real evidence that that's going to lead to nightmares.
How funny. Okay. When you and your partner have different sleep patterns, i.e. one person likes to get up very early, maybe 90 minutes to 2 hours before the other, do you have any tips for how to best make it more harmonious for both people? This would be a good time for me to actually comment on the fact that during the pandemic, me and my wife decided we've just got very different sleeping behavior. She loves to go to bed super late, literally super late. And her narrative that she's a night owl is so ingrained that there's no coming out from it. And I have a lot of work to do early. And I like to go for my walk and I like to exercise, I like to do as much of that before work. So it just wasn't working. And it was putting us in bad moods, right? And that because, it's not fair to both of you to compromise in that sense. So we started sleeping in separate rooms, which everyone thought was absolutely nuts, obviously, and thought we're having problems. But actually, it strengthened our marriage. So we spend the time before bed, like all the way up until I'm about to do my meditation before bed. That's just what I happen to do. She doesn't. And then she goes into the other room and I do that. And we sleep much more harmoniously now. So I know that's one answer, but what about other people?
I think it's a great answer. I think the most important thing is that you talk about it because actually this can be quite an emotive issue, particularly.
We felt very judged for sure.
It tends to be actually on research suggests that usually men prefer sleeping together, and it's actually women who are more likely to be disturbed by their partner either snoring or moving in the night. But we also know that sleep deprivation is kind of a kiss of death for relationships. It makes you more likely to argue, it makes you less patient, you're much more kind of negative when you try and solve your argument. So absolutely critical that you have an open discussion about what you want and what is most important to you. For a lot of people, it's actually that period of that bit before you switch the light out. So, when you have that moment of intimacy, nobody wants to lose that. But if you can still have that and then have a bit of time apart, I actually think it's really healthy that, you've potentially got some time in the morning when you get to do your stuff and she's got that time in the evening, which is just kind of me time. And maybe, that's a good compromise for you. For other couples, they might just decide to move their bedtimes half an hour closer to the other person's. And keep in mind those signals, the light, the food, the movement, those are going to help if you really want to move your body clock forwards or backwards.
Amazing. Sophie, it's been super, super helpful and insightful having you just express everything that you know about sleep and also having all of the wise words that have helped the community out as well. So thank you to everyone for joining the YouTube Live. Please do check out the Braincare podcast. Every episode is just 15 minutes. And for more about how Heights can help you with sleep, you can go to yourheights.com/sleep. Now, the next YouTube Live we're going to be doing is a lunch and learn. So it'll be at 1 p.m. and with behavioral design expert and best-selling author Nir Ayal on how to focus and become indistractable. It's a big claim, but so is helping you sleep. So we like to try and tackle the big ones where we can. My final point would be that it's Random Act of Kindness Day. So please go forth and surprise someone with kindness And if you're doing it and you're making someone else happy, there's a very good chance that you'll have an even better night's sleep in doing so. Sophie, where can people find you and follow you, please?
I'm on the sleepscientist.com or on Instagram or Twitter at Dr. Sophie Bostock.